early 1779, the American Revolutionary War had been underway for nearly 3 years and had reached a bit of an impasse. On the outbreak of war, the British Army had pretty much abandoned New England and the Carolinas and concentrated their troops in New York and the South, stymieing all efforts by the Patriot forces to dislodge them. Unfortunately, this largely left Massachusetts, very much the centre of the revolution, as independent by default, and the British authorities eventually decided something needed to be done to disrupt this rebel stronghold. Their plan was to establish a military base on the northeastern coast at Penobscot Bay in the province of Maine, then part of Massachusetts. The idea was to provide a base for the Royal Navy and thereby disrupt the numerous New England privateers that were harassing Nova Scotian shipping. Secondly, it would provide a haven for local loyalists, who were having a hard time of it from Patriot authorities. And thirdly, it would challenge the Massachusetts state government by setting up a rival colony, to be called New Ireland. The man tasked with building this base was Brigadier General Francis McLean. McLean was a 62-year-old veteran of numerous campaigns and nearly 20 battles. His naval counterpart was Lieutenant Henry Mowat, another very experienced officer who had been on the American station for several years. McLean's expedition left Halifax, Nova Scotia on May 30th, 1779 in 6 transports escorted by 6 warships. The journey was hampered by contrary winds and only arrived at Penobscot Bay on June 12th. McLean reconnoitred for 2 days before selecting a favourable site high on Bagaduce Peninsula for his fortifications. From here he could command the principal passage into the inner harbour. The main defensive position was to be named Fort George and was located at the centre of the peninsula, with batteries outside to provide cover for the British ships, one of them being on an island south of the bay near the mouth of the river. The area was very rugged and the climate was harsh. The local population was small and poor, and McLean had no problems hiring 100 of them to help clear the land and assist with the construction work. McLean's command was hardly a crack force. His troops consisted of 450 men from the 74th Highland Regiment and 200 from the 82nd Duke of Hamilton's Regiment. Both units were well trained and disciplined, but inexperienced, consisting largely of new recruits. There were also small contingents of Royal Engineers and Royal Artillery gunners, some 50 in total. The position was isolated and until the fort was completed, very vulnerable. Accordingly, McLean gave priority to the emplacement of gun batteries for immediate defence against an American attack. 3 of the warships were returned to other duties, but Mowat anchored the remaining 3 across the entrance to the inner harbour to help defend the area and the Bagaduce River while the fort was being built. These measures were vindicated when information reached McLean the Americans were planning to assault his position. Word of this provocative incursion had indeed quickly reached the Massachusetts state government in Boston, resulting in considerable indignity, even alarm. The loyalty of the Indians in the Penobscot area to the new revolutionary government was shaky, and the establishment of a British Army fort nearby might swing them completely over to the Loyalist side. If local Loyalists also rallied to the location, there was a possibility Massachusetts could lose the whole area in a future negotiated settlement. There were other considerations. The state of Massachusetts had not been involved in much of the fighting. Boston politicians were keen to show that their native state was just as involved as any of the others. In short, they saw an attack on this fort as an opportunity to aggrandise their native state. Besides, there would be loot as well as glory to be had in capturing this fort, enough to make a considerable profit on the costs of the attack. Accordingly, the state of Massachusetts organised the largest American naval expedition of the war, an armada of 19 warships and 25 support vessels. For political reasons, the intention was for all the ships and soldiers to be provided by the state of Massachusetts, but in the event this proved impossible, and the state legislature was forced to petition for support from the Continental Navy. The Continentals accordingly supplied 3 warships, the USS Warren, the USS Diligent, and the USS Providence. The skipper of the Warren, Dudley Saltonstall, was appointed to take overall command of the naval component. Despite its numbers, Saltonstall's little fleet was not a strong force. The 32-gun USS Warren was by far the most powerful vessel, and Saltonstall had only just been appointed to her command. The rest of the squadron was a melange of ships from the Massachusetts State Navy, but also included a large number of privateers, who were used to acting independently, resented taking orders, and were very averse to getting their ships shot up. In any case, none of the captains had any experience in fleet operations, including Saltonstall. The command of the land forces was given to Brigadier General Solomon Lovell, a Massachusetts militia officer and occasional representative to the state legislature. It seemed that Lovell primarily owed his appointment to his political and social links, as he was not a particularly experienced commander. He had seen limited service in the French and Indian Wars as a junior officer, and earlier in the Revolutionary War he had helped defend Boston and been involved in the inconclusive assault on Rhode Island, but he had never led a major independent land expedition. His force consisted of some 1,100 colonial marines and state militia, a much smaller force than had been hoped for. The best and most dedicated recruits in Massachusetts had long ago signed up for the Continental Army, leaving Lovell with many old men and underage reservists, and even some invalids. Lovell's two principal subordinates were his second-in-command, Brigadier General Peleg Wadsworth, a very competent militiaman with a flair for organisation, and none other than the famous Paul Revere, a rabid supporter of the Revolution who had been turned down by the Continental Army and had therefore accepted a colonelcy in the Massachusetts militia. Revere was in charge of the expedition's artillery train, which amounted to a dozen assorted field guns and about 100 gunners. The fleet sailed for Penobscot Bay on July the 19th, arriving on July the 25th, when a council of war was called to decide on a course of action. It was here that a major weakness in the structure of the expedition came to light. Lovell was in charge of the land forces and Saltonstall the naval, but there was no overall commander. If the two were to disagree over tactics, the resulting lack of coordination would be a major hindrance to American operations. There are two main methods of capturing a fortified position. You can storm it and overwhelm the defenders, or you can besiege it and starve them out. Each has its advantages and disadvantages. Storming is quick and decisive, but if it doesn't work, casualties can be horrendous. Besieging is slower but more certain, but it also gives the defenders more time, which means that if they bring up extra support, it might turn out to be just as bloody and prone to failing. Either method could work, but trying to do both was a recipe for disaster, and that is what the Patriot forces ended up doing. At the assorted council of wars that were called, it became very clear there was a sharp division over which course to take. Some of Lovell's officers, including Wadsworth, favoured assaults. Others, including Saltonstall and Revere, were more circumspect. However, when they first arrived, a close examination of the fort and its defences soon swung the argument in favour of an immediate assault. Maclean had feverishly worked on his defences, but they were far from complete when the American squadron hove into view. The walls of Fort George were still so low it was possible to vault over them, and although 3 batteries had been constructed to enfilade the harbour, they were just simple emplacements and not fortified at all. The guns themselves were only 6 and 9 pounders taken from the port sides of the 3 British warships blocking the harbour entrance. The entire area was far too large to be defended by the number of troops available. The sight of the immense American armada was daunting. 20-plus transports could easily be holding well over 3,000 men, so Maclean was fully justified in thinking he was heavily outnumbered. Lovell planned to launch his troops against the bluffs on the western end of the promontory, and from there outflank the British batteries and sweep into Fort George. Saltonstall refused to assault the Royal Navy sloops, blocking the narrow harbour entrance. The area was contracted and shallow, and the presence of batteries high on the hills virtually surrounding the area would risk heavy losses. He did, however, agree to undertake a long-range bombardment of the blocking British ships to mask the American landing and pin the defenders in position. For 3.5 hours the 9 larger American ships took turns to exchange fire with the Royal Navy sloops. The firing was intense, but little damage was done, although the Americans definitely got the worst of it. The landing was called off because of choppy seas and strong winds, which made manoeuvring the boats difficult. It was a dismal beginning to the operation. The following day Lovell called another council of war to consider options. Saltonstall reiterated his opposition to moving his ships into the treacherous harbour entrance while the area was still covered by British batteries. The obvious solution was to remove them, and the best target was clearly the isolated battery on the southernmost island. The plan agreed for July the 26th was for the fleet's marines, by far the best troops available to Lovell, to assault the battery from the south, while the militia would directly assault the bluffs and, if possible, the northern batteries. Saltonstall's ships would once again mask the defenders by engaging the Royal Navy's sloops. The wind was very light and most of the American ships had to be rowed into position, delaying the attack. Once again the firing was intense, but little damage was done. The attack on the Nautilus Island battery was further delayed when the ships carrying the assaulting troops ran aground, but when the American Marines managed to land, they were instantly successful. The battery was surprised and overrun before the guns could be spiked. The militia attack on the bluffs was timed to go in at dusk, but the British detected them and a lucky shot from the sloops smashed the lead boat, killing the commander and discouraging the militia enough to cancel the attack. Still, the Nautilus Island battery had been seized, and Lovell was quick to order Revere to place guns on the position, from where they quickly made the blocking position maintained by the British sloops untenable. Mowat had been surprised that the American warships had not pressed an attack home, which would certainly have taken lots of damage, but equally would certainly have overwhelmed his meagre force. Nonetheless, he was forced to pull his vessels 450 yards to the east, from where they still blocked the rover but could no longer interfere with US landings on the peninsula. Buoyed by this success, and frustrated by Saltonstall's caution, 32 captains and senior officers from the fleet presented the Commodore with a petition calling for an immediate attack on the Royal Navy presence in the harbour. Saltonstall did not respond. The incident illustrates the divisions in the US force. Maclean was also confused but obviously delighted by the sluggishness of the American advance. He used the respite to build up Fort George as much as possible, but in this he was hampered by having to detail large numbers of pickets to warn of and resist American landings, which must surely soon come. He was particularly worried there would be a landing to the north of the peninsula. If the neck was occupied, it would block his line of retreat and pretty much surround his entire force, so a considerable effort was made to place an abattis between the fort and the neck to parry any assault from that direction. However, Lovell was not intending to attack the neck of the promontory. He planned a dawn attack on the western side of the peninsula. This was risky because the troops would have to be moved into assault positions during the night, and the slopes were very steep. Firm opposition could prove disastrous. Fortunately for Lovell, Maclean's paucity of soldiers meant the defenders were too spread out, and the strongest concentration was facing the feared attack on the neck. There were only about 80 troops defending the western side of the peninsula. The Americans had also received some reinforcements. They had called up the local militia, although the response was decidedly lukewarm, and in spite of fears about their loyalties, about 40 or 50 Penobscot Indians had also joined the expedition. The attack went in on the morning of July the 28th, following a furious shore bombardment from 3 of the American sloops. Personally led by Brigadier General Wadsworth, a mixed force of militia and marines landed successfully on the rocky shore of Dicey's Head and clambered up the slopes, under intense if limited British fire. Among the defenders was one Lieutenant John Moore, later become General Moore, victor at the Battle of Corunna in Spain. Moore and his fellow defenders inflicted substantial casualties on the attacking Americans, particularly the Marines, but the British pickets were hopelessly outnumbered and were eventually driven from the high ground into the fort. 8 British soldiers were captured. If the Americans had continued to sweep forward, it is entirely possible the fort would have fallen there and then, but Lovell, unsure of the strength of the defences and dismayed at the casualties already suffered, ordered his troops to remain on the wooded high ground and dig in. He intended now to bombard the fort into submission and ordered Revere, whose gunners had been acting as a reserve, to establish cannon on the heights as soon as possible. Meanwhile, perhaps spurred on by the petition, Saltonstall led 3 American ships forward to attack the British sloops at close range. Unfortunately, the wind was light and blowing towards the attackers, and progress was slow. Saltonstall found it hard to engage his enemies with broadsides, and the net result was that little damage was done to the British vessels, while British return fire inflicted significant damage, particularly to the USS Warren. This event seemed to justify Saltonstall in his caution, and made him even more reluctant to attack the Royal Navy presence. Maclean took full advantage of Lovell's vacillation. He continued to strengthen Fort George as much as he could, and formed a flying light infantry company to harass the American fortifications on the western heights of Bagaduce. Mowat ordered all but one of the transports to be beached and burned, preventing any option of withdrawal. The last transport, the St. Helena, was armed with 6 cannon and used to reinforce his 3-ship fighting line. Demonstrating the much greater coordination of the British forces, Mowat sent most of the unengaged guns from his squadron to reinforce Fort George, along with enough sailors to man them. Over the next 3 days, the opposing forces simply cannonaded each other. As long as the British warships continued to hold the harbour, they were able to pin down the American forces on the peninsula. Fort George, still only half constructed, proved remarkably resistant to Revere's bombardment. The American commanders were soon at odds. Lovell wanted Saltonstall to destroy the British ships so that he could assault the fort. Saltonstall wanted Lovell to destroy the British batteries before he would countenance attacking their ships. As neither had the authority to give orders to the other, very little got done. The only action that could be agreed upon was to sight more cannon on the heights, from where they could fire on and hopefully suppress the British Half Moon battery covering the northern part of the harbour. On July the 30th, a dispatch galley, the Lincoln, arrived from the Massachusetts Council. They urged both Lovell and Saltonstall to press home their attacks, as it seemed likely the British would be sending reinforcements. This seems to have galvanised the two. Saltonstall reinforced the picket ship he had deployed to the south as a lookout with 2 more, and Lovell planned a night assault on the Half Moon battery. If that could be captured, Saltonstall would have no excuse not to attack the covering British warships. The plan was to attack in 3 columns. On the left were the US Marines, the centre was composed of the Lincoln County Militia, the right with a party of sailors from the fleet. The American brig Skyrocket was to bombard the battery, distracting the defenders. The attack started at 2 a.m. The British returned fire briskly, and the American militia broke and ran immediately. However, the other 2 columns gritted their teeth, charged through the hail of musket balls and canister, and stormed the low breastworks. The British were driven back to Fort George. This was a major achievement. Not only did it remove one of the main supports for the blocking Royal Navy sloops, but in American hands the Half Moon battery would be a good site for heavy American cannon. That would enable them to bombard both the sloops and Fort George much more efficiently. Lovell's elation was short-lived. The exultant attackers were so busy celebrating that they neglected to post proper guards. At dawn, the British counterattacked and retook the position, capturing 18 militiamen. However, conscious of just how exposed it was, the British then abandoned the battery and returned to Fort George, leaving it unoccupied. Without the support of the battery, Mowat pulled his 4 remaining vessels another 450 yards upriver. The defenders were still just about hanging on. The American militia had not performed well. Morale was declining and desertion was becoming an increasing problem. The abandoned battery position gave Lovell an idea. A small detachment was sent to give the impression the position was being refortified, while a large body of militia were hidden nearby behind thick crops. The idea was that the British, fearing the Americans were planning to reactivate the Half Moon battery, would sally out to disrupt the work, whereupon the hidden militia would leap out and surprise them. Lovell hoped such a victory would revitalise the spirits of the militia, as well as demoralise the defenders. Unfortunately, the British saw through the ruse and prepared a counter-ambush, which drove the militia off. Lovell tried again the following day with the same results. Appeals to Saltonstall to assault the British ships were once again rejected. It was clear now to Lovell that a direct assault was no longer feasible, so he resorted completely to the alternate strategy of besieging. A battery was constructed to the far east of the harbour, on the land of a farmer called Haney. It was hoped this would make Mowat's position completely untenable, but the firing from the battery was relatively ineffective due to the range. The British reacted strongly because their reinforcement of Fort George had concentrated on its western side, facing the American encampment. The eastern walls were hardly built, so Maclean ordered a redoubt to be constructed between the ships and the fort to block an attack from that direction. The siege continued over the next several days with nothing more than skirmishes and long-range artillery fire. Few casualties were inflicted by either side. The American commanders seemed to have complacently relapsed into believing there was no urgency required, in spite of constant urgings to attack from the authorities in Boston. Lovell had requested reinforcements in response, but it was only when he learned that on August the 3rd, Captain, later Vice Admiral, Sir George Collier had led a fleet of 10 British warships out of New York Harbour that he began to consider that he might be running out of time. Collier's destination was unknown, but there had to be at least a significant chance they were on their way to Penobscot. Having come to the conclusion the new Haney battery was ineffective, Lovell halted its expansion and transferred the heavy guns onto the American transports. On the morning of August 13th, at yet another Council of War, a coordinated land-sea attack was finally agreed. 400 troops were allocated to storm the eastern flank of Fort George, while Commodore Saltonstall led 5 ships into the harbour to engage the British sloops. However, just as this attack was being organised, the American sloop Diligence, which had been acting as a picket ship, sailed into the harbour with news that 6 heavily armed British warships were just off the coast. Saltonstall immediately broke off the planned attack and advised Lovell to reboard his troops onto the transports and head upriver, which was done. A final council of war was called the following morning. Saltonstall had anchored his 17 warships into a defensive line. Even now he had more warships than the British and deployed far more cannon, although admittedly the guns on the American ships were of smaller calibre. Some captains believed he could make a fight of it. Others recommended that the fleet move round the west side of Long Island and make a dash for the safety of the open sea. Saltonstall, however, decided to flee with a flood current up the Penobscot River. The laden American transports were already floating slowly upriver with the tide. Lovell planned to find a convenient bend in the river, beach the transports, unload their cannon, and create a fortified position to hold the British off, thus allowing the bulk of his force to escape. Saltonstall gave the idea short shrift. He made it perfectly clear that he intended to proceed upriver and then scuttle his ships. In order to do this, he essentially ordered each ship to act independently, and the fleet organisation dissolved. As the British force closed in, only one American ship, the privateer sloop Hampden, turned to engage them. HMS Blonde and HMS Virginia, each of which were twice her size, swiftly overwhelmed her. 2 other privateers, the Hunter and the Defence, attempted to flee west around Long Island. The British were alive to this tactic, however, and other British frigates moved to intercept them. After a short exchange of fire, Hunter was driven ashore on the west bank of the bay, and Defence was scuttled in Stockton Springs Harbour. The rout was now on. As the American vessels drifted or were rowed up river, not all proceeded at the same pace, and panic soon spread to any that were overtaken. Many vessels were grounded and burned in Mill Cove on the west bank of the river, their crews and passengers taken to the woods. It became impossible to carry out Lovell's plan of creating a fortified position. By August 16th, every single one of the American ships had been beached and scuttled, although some were subsequently refloated and reused by the British. Saltonstall's flagship, Warren, only received a temporary stay when she ran aground on the 15th and had to wait for the tide to rise before her stores could be unloaded. Saltonstall then ordered her burnt. Wadsworth was instrumental in organising the vast mass of American sailors and militiamen who were now forced to return to Boston overland. The trek was arduous, involving a 4 to 6 week trudge through the wilderness with little food or supplies. Lovell himself headed to the Penobscot Indian encampments, where he did at least manage to sign a treaty preventing the Indians siding with the British. That was the only really tangible result for the Patriots from the Penobscot expedition. Considering the size and length and intensity of the Penobscot campaign, there were surprisingly few casualties. The Patriot commanders may have hideously mismanaged the expedition, but at least it wasn't a bloodbath. According to British records, their garrison suffered a loss of 25 killed and 34 wounded. The total number of missing is unknown, but the Americans are known to have taken 26 prisoners. Total American casualties during the actual fighting came to about 150, the vast majority of which was suffered during the initial assault on Bagaduce Heights. The main losses came during the chaotic retreat upriver and back to Boston, where some succumbed to disease and privation, and a great many more, possibly over 300, went missing, essentially deserted. The repercussions from the Penobscot debacle were immediate. The defeat was humiliating for Massachusetts, and the economic consequences devastating. The state had financed the entire expedition to the tune of over £2 million, equivalent to nigh on $400 million in 2024, and it lost every penny. It was this effective bankrupting of Massachusetts that may have led to one of the most pernicious aspects of Penobscot. There were many reasons for the failure of the expedition. The lack of an overall commander was a major factor, particularly as it was married to a marked lack of cooperation between sea and land forces. The paucity of the troops available and their general low quality didn't help either. Few of the commanders covered themselves with glory, and Lovell and Saltonstall were both clearly out of their depth. Lovell chopped and changed his plans far too often, and Saltonstall was certainly too cautious. But in the subsequent inquiries, it was Saltonstall who got the main blame. He was court-martialed and dismissed from military service. The implication is that the disgrace of Saltonstall suited the estate of Massachusetts. He was a Continental Navy officer, and if he could be proven culpable for the failure at Penobscot, Massachusetts could petition Congress to cover the costs of the expedition. This they did. It took some years, but eventually, in 1793, the federal government agreed to reimburse the state's financial losses. Curiously, his disgrace hardly affected Saltonstall's subsequent career. He managed to persuade his family to invest in a privateer, the Minerva, and as its captain in 1781 he captured one of the richest prizes of the Revolutionary War, the merchant vessel Hannah, valued at £80,000. He continued a successful career as a trader until his death in 1796. The only other commander who suffered from the results of the Penobscot expedition was Paul Revere. Accused of disobedience and cowardice, principally by Wadsworth, he was placed under house arrest and dismissed from the militia, although he was cleared of most of the charges in a subsequent court-martial. Revere was dissatisfied with the result and requested a second court-martial, as a result of which he was declared to have discharged his duties with equal honour to any other officer, which, given the results of Penobscot, was hardly a ringing endorsement. His reputation as an American icon is solely down to the publishing of Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, in 1861. Solomon Lovell was completely exonerated of any fault for his role in the Penobscot expedition, largely because of his political connections. However, he was never again given a major military command, and had a mediocre political career post-war, dying in 1801. Wadsworth had performed very credibly and also escaped censure. He was actually Longfellow's grandfather, and no doubt would have been surprised at Revere's elevation to the status of a national hero. General Maclean had little time to gain plaudits for his successful defence of Fort George, as he died of natural causes less than 2 years later. Henry Mowat was promoted to captain on the strength of his performance, and had a distinguished career in the Royal Navy until his own death, of natural causes, in 1798. The British continued to garrison Bagaduce for the rest of the war. In fact, it was the last part of the United States they occupied. They only abandoned Fort George in this attempt to establish New Ireland because of the terms of the 1783 Peace of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. About 600 loyalists left with them and relocated to New Brunswick, where they founded the town of St Andrews.